Is with us for our Conversations with the Great Minds segment. He's Associate Professor of Global Politics at the University College London, columnist with the Washington Post, the host of the podcast Power Corrupts, and the author of this new book, this extraordinary new book, Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. And Dr. Klaas, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for writing the book. I'd like to kind of go through, as you've organized the book, you know, the table of contents, essentially. Let's start out by defining power, who gets power and how it changes us, you know, Corruptible, the title of your book. How are you defining power here, and what is the evolutionary history, I suppose, culturally, psychologically, socially speaking, of it?
Yeah, so power is about wielding authority over somebody else. You can't have power unless you have the authority to make somebody do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And what I'm really looking at is formal hierarchical power. So the idea of somebody being in an organization above you, your boss, the president, a police officer. And what I'm trying to do in the book is answer this age-old chicken or egg question of, do corruptible people seek power, or does power corrupt? And the answer really is both, but I'm trying to figure out how we can engineer systems that change the status quo so that the current system of corruptible people seeking power and getting it more effectively than others is inverted, and we have normal, decent people self-select into positions of authority and wield it justly, and that's what the book is really about.
Now, this is not something that is altogether unusual in history, is it? Egalitarian political and economic systems?
Yeah, you know, so what I'm looking at in the broad sweep of history is that most of the sort of Stone Age past that humans had was mostly egalitarian. Most hunter-gatherers, even to this day, the ones who are the uncontacted groups and so on, have more egalitarian systems. And there's sort of two things that change, what I call pithily in the book, the war and peace hypothesis, peace as in P-E-A-S. And that's because warfare and agriculture are really two major drivers in anthropological history of understanding why we have hierarchies, why we have bosses and bosses' bosses and so on. And what's interesting here, I think, is how when you have hierarchy, it's not necessarily good or bad. I mean, one of the experts that I interviewed said hierarchy is like fire. It can be used to cook food or it can burn people. And so it's not necessarily the aspect of power that's the problem. It's the way it's designed in modern society that unfortunately is like a red carpet to Machiavellian psychopathic narcissists in modern society. And that's really what I'm setting out to try to counteract.
For example?
So, for example, one of the things that you need to think about when you think about systems of power is who tries to become powerful. And there's a self-selection process. So in the psychology literature, for example, there's a set of traits called the dark triad: Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy. Now, when you think about who actually decides they want to be powerful and how they can get power, narcissistic Machiavellian psychopaths are very, very good at superficial charm, at making people like them for short periods of time. It is the ideal persona for a job interview. It's the ideal persona for an election. And so what I argue is that small tweaks can help us change this. So one small example is that when you look at studies that use CVs and they randomize names on the top of fake CVs, fake resumes, of equal quality, the people who are white and male get more job offers and more job interviews than the people whose names are not white and male. And so, you know, simply by anonymizing applications, you could actually get a much fairer system. It's a very, very simple tweak, but it would make society fairer. And then on top of that, you have to think about the system. So one of my favorite studies in the book asked these students to roll a dice 42 times and then self-report their scores. And the more times they rolled a 6, or they claimed they rolled a 6, the more money they'd get. Now, when they did the study in India and they surveyed the students who lied disproportionately about their dice rolls, they said they rolled 6s way more than they actually did, those were the students that said in career surveys that they wanted to go into the civil service, where you could extract bribes and engage in kickbacks. When they did the exact same study in Denmark, the results were inverted. The students who were honest and responsible in reporting their dice rolls were the ones who wanted to go in the squeaky clean civil service in Denmark. And so what I think is a crucial insight here is that rotten systems attract rotten people and good systems attract good people. And so to me, you know, it's not just these sayings like power corrupt or corruptible people are drawn to power, there's this missing variable of how you design a society, how you design a system that attracts better people into power and makes sure they get there, rather than catering to narcissistic Machiavellian psychopaths, which we seem to have plenty of the further up we look on the food chain.
Yeah, I don't know if you object to bringing politics into this, just let me know. But it seems like since the Supreme Court legalized the bribery of political officials, and first by wealthy individuals in 1976 with the Buckley decision, then with corporations in the Bellotti decision in '78, and then tripled down on it with Citizens United in 2010. We have gone from, well, in the 60s, the average piece of legislation that passed the House was 56% of the time passed the Senate. Now we're at around 4 or 5%. I mean, it has become that, and stuff isn't even passing the House. I mean, it's just become that crippled. It seems like, to me, that this decision that legal corruption, that legal bribery, that giving money to politicians in exchange for their doing what you want, which we used to call bribery, and we haven't been able to legally call bribery since '76, which I argue brought us the Reagan Revolution, that is exactly what you're talking about, an example that every American can understand and identify. Am I off base there?
No, you're completely right. And I think this goes to that idea of what I call the self-selection into power. So if you're power hungry, if you want power, you'll do anything to get it, right? But now what we've done is we've made it so that in order to run for office in the United States, you basically have to be rich, or you have to be willing to accept a lot of money from potentially nefarious sources. And so what it's done is it's repulsed all the normal, decent people who just want to serve their communities, because they don't want the power for the sake of power. They look at what politics has become, this cesspool, and they just self-select out of it. They say, I'll do something else with my time. I don't want to have this whole, constant treadmill of raising money or meeting with lobbyists. And so, what I'm speaking about is exactly this, that when you make a system toxic, when you make it overflowing with money and special interests, you're going to get the people who don't mind that going into politics. They're the ones who are not just going to not mind it, they're actually going to find it attractive because they get the big payoffs at the end of the day. They want the money, they want the power, and that's the point of the system. If you're driven by public service, you're simply going to go into a different job. And I think this is the problem, is that we've actually designed a system that attracts the worst of our society. And until we deal with that, it's going to act like sort of this steroid to the effect that already exists in human society, that power-hungry people go towards power, and they're better at getting it than most of the rest of us who are not Machiavellian psychopaths. And so, I worry a lot about this intersection between individuals and systems, and the modern United States is one that's given lots of rewards and incentives to the worst among us going to the top.
Now, we have in the United States, on several points that we can identify historically, rejected or pushed back against this tendency. I mean, 1891, the Sherman Antitrust Act, trying to stop this predatory capitalist behavior of people like John Rockefeller. 1907, the Tillman Act, that made it a federal felony for any corporation to give money to any candidate for political office at the federal level. That was incorporated into, I'm forgetting the name of the law, in the 1920s. We have tried we've had little mini revolutions against corruption in the in '74 we passed literally hundreds of laws statewide across the states and federally for what you might call good government laws in the wake of the Nixon and Agnew bribery scandals. Those were all, of course, blown up, not all of them in '76 with Buckley, but by 2010 all of them were blown up, or the vast majority of them, with Citizens United. Are there other countries, are there other examples of times when systems have self-corrected? And is it possible for a system to become so corrupt that self-correction is impossible short of anything like just a complete political revolution?
Yeah, I think the real problem is that you have the foxes guarding the hen houses here. So you're reliant to a certain extent on corruptible individuals who are already becoming corrupt by the system, reforming it, and often putting themselves out of a job. So I'll give you one example of how I think we can deal with this, and it's sort of an outside-the-box example, but I think it's important. I propose in the book that we have we basically set up a randomly selected shadow Congress, for example, in the United States. So this draws on this concept of sortition that's from ancient Greece, where you had sort of jury duty citizen assemblies. I don't think that's a good idea in the modern era, because I think the complexity of politics is such that you need actual specialists in Congress itself. But I think a shadow one that has a random assortment of Americans in it, would not engage in the same sort of corrupt decision-making that our actual Congress does. And by having it in place, it would actually expose when real Congress people were doing things because lobbyists were telling them to do so. So if you just randomly selected, say, 435 Americans and said, look, you have to debate the same bills, the same sort of ideas that Congress does. It's not binding, but everybody in America is going to be able to see what you decide. It would provide a nice, very light touch check on Congress actually engaging in corruption. And this doesn't require any law. You can just set it up. And I think this is the kind of outside-the-box thinking we need to redesign our societies.
Power literally corrupts. How power changes, I mean, you've got a chapter titled, How Power Changes Your Body. What does power do to humans?
Well, it does a couple things, psychologically and physically. So on the psychological level, it warps your thinking. And the most basic way of understanding this is that people who are truly in power don't have normal experiences. I mean, I spoke at one point to Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, and what he said was, you know, I walk into a room and everybody laughs at every joke. Everybody stands up and cheers when I'm running for president. That's not a normal human experience. Now, this happens to all sorts of people in power, and there's an asymmetry in how much powerful people need their underlings compared to how much the underlings need the powerful people. So, you know, there's this sort of Hegelian, the philosopher Hegel talks about this relationship between a master and an enslaved person and says, look, you know, the master doesn't really need to know that much about the enslaved person. The enslaved person needs to know about the master because otherwise they're going to get beaten. And that dynamic also explains in the modern world why often people don't know, like the bosses don't know their employees' birthdays, but the employees know their boss's birthday because there's an asymmetric relationship in terms of how important someone seems to you. Now, when that actually seeps into your thinking, it starts to make the people below you abstract. They're not important. They're not worth their consideration. And it does, we've seen this in psychology studies, that people become more disposable in your thinking. Now, it actually also changes your body. There's a stress effect that we've seen, and also truly powerful people like presidents die faster because of the actual toll that it takes. But there's an amazing study from non-human primates that I talk about in the book, in which monkeys are put into hierarchies and then offered the choice between banana pellets and cocaine, intravenous cocaine injected into their bodies. They can pull one lever and get a banana pellet, another lever, and they get cocaine. And what's amazing is that the monkeys that are on the top of the hierarchy always take the banana pellets. The ones who end up on the bottom always take the cocaine. And even if you take a powerful monkey, one that's on top, and then put it into a different situation where it ends up on the bottom, it switches. And amazingly, when they look at the dopamine receptors in their brains, the physical structure has actually changed. So there's truly astonishing research that power is actually like a drug that does change the chemical composition of human brains and of non-human primate brains. And it's much more complicated than just that pithy saying that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, Lord Acton's saying. There have been numerous studies over the years showing that people who are lower on social hierarchies, whether they be racial hierarchies in those societies that are organized that way, like ours is, tragically, or economic hierarchies, score higher on tests of empathy than do people who are higher in the hierarchy. This is the same phenomenon, right?
Yeah, and, you know, this also, there's a whole series of psychological literature that does show how power corrupts. And one of my favorite studies that resonates with what you just said about the aspects of empathy and so on is there's a psychologist named Dacher Keltner out at UC Berkeley. And he did this study with the fanciness of cars, in which a grad student would walk into a crosswalk and see if the car stopped to be courteous. And amazingly, there was a strong correlation between how expensive the car was and how often they stopped. So the people with sort of the junkers, they stopped for the person in the crosswalk. The people in the Teslas and fancy cars, BMWs, just kept on going.
Dr. Klaas, we were talking about systems and people, and you mentioned psychopathy. I'm wondering, throughout history, you know, as we look at at situations, there's, you know, there are these competing notions of the great man theory of history. History is defined by its leaders, but, you know, or versus the idea that people step into opportunities provided by the times. To what extent are our political and economic lives being driven by people whose own internal motivations are either narcissistic and psychopathic? On the one hand, I'm thinking, you know, Donald Trump, or I'm thinking Chainsaw Al Dunlop, who reveled in the fact that he had fired over 10,000 employees during his career. Started out at Sunbeam, and then he became a killer for hire, essentially, a hitman for hire for, you know, giant corporations that wanted to downsize, versus you know, times that we have been the exact opposite of that, more egalitarian.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because it's both. I mean, it's certainly the case that there are opportunities that are presented by social change, but then who walks into that opportunity does really matter. And I think this has been a mistake, by the way, in social science in modern times, because often you'll talk about the presidency as though the presidency is this one thing. And trying to explain U.S. politics in the last 5-6 years without reference to Donald Trump's personality type is foolhardy. It's a stupid thing to do because he obviously has changed the system dramatically. What we know about the people with the dark triad, that Machiavellian narcissistic psychopathy, being a psychopath, is that they are a small number of people in society writ large, and they're massively overrepresented in power. And so they do disproportionate damage. And because they're so ruthless, and because some of our systems make it easy for them to work their way up the food chain, so to speak, they're disproportionately dangerous. And depending on the study you look at, there's either 4 times or 100 times, somewhere in that range, the number of psychopaths in top levels of leadership in society relative to the general population. So even though it's unlikely that your manager is a psychopath, the number of people who are in consequential positions does a huge amount of damage, which is why I devote a significant chunk of the book to them, because they are so dangerous. And so, you know, we do have good leaders around us. There are good people who go into power. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise, but there's a special amount of attention that's warranted to these particularly destructive individuals, because they don't just do damage. They also set systems on a crash course for even worse behavior. So if you think about Trump, for example, he has not just done damage while he's in the presidency. He's actually changed the way the Republican Party operates. He's removed constraints from people in power by making clear that you can get away with a huge amount of stuff. And so that individual has done way more damage than a normal president would do in a 4-year term. And so, you know, they warrant special consideration, but they are massively overrepresented in positions of power.
Brian, we have a little less than a minute left. How do we best shun these people? How do we isolate them? How do we identify them? I know, you know, Aboriginal societies do this routinely.
It's a great question. I've got 10 ideas in the book that will help fix this. But one thing that I think is the most simple is we need to start recruiting people who already behave with integrity rather than waiting for people to say, I should be powerful, let me run for office. I think there are too many times in which we allow self-selection where someone says, I should be the leader, and those people are most likely to be power hungry. And instead we need to say, I know you think the power will be burdensome to you. You don't want it, but that's precisely why you should have it. And the more that we proactively headhunt people who have proven their moral worth in society, the better our systems are going to end up in the end.
Wow. The interrelationship between systems and personality is extraordinary. And a brilliant book here. Dr. Brian Klaas, Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. Brian, thanks so much for dropping by today. It's been fascinating.